at Policy Day here. Dr. Rich Simmons again, and we're now going to talk today about energy policy. And so we decided to come to the Georgia State Capitol here in Atlanta, Georgia. You have where the General Assembly meets. Today we're going to talk about energy policy in general. Energy policy is a complicated thing in the U.S. involving many levels of jurisdiction, including the national agenda, the state agenda, and then municipal and county jurisdictions as well have authority over decisions that go into energy. Now, the goal of any level at which we're trying to do better public policy, including energy planning, is to assure a secure supply of energy. In addition, we want to make sure that costs are affordable. And the third tenet, the third sort of leg of the stool, is environmental sustainability and social sustainability. So regardless of what jurisdiction we're approaching this challenge of doing energy planning and decision making and regulation well, we're always thinking about these three aspects and trying to make sure that we address them all to the good of the citizens involved. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go inside and break this down a little bit more and talk about how the specific objectives are actually executed in energy policy. So given that we need energy security, we need sustainability and affordability, we can go one layer deeper and think about the elements that make up a really effective energy policy strategy, which address things that the public cares about, like energy efficiency, reduced dependence on oil, whether that's foreign or in general, a diversity of resources, meaning we're not reliant on any one thing too much. And then, of course, clean energy. These are the hot topics that the public has strong views about and that integrate themselves into this discourse of implementing energy policy. Now, if we take a step back, we're standing here in a state legislature. It happens to be the Senate in Georgia, but there's one very similar in every state, and there's one, obviously, at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., where the Congress has a significant role in writing laws and regulations to govern the activities that relate to energy policy. Now, in addition to Congress, there are several important executive branch agencies. For example, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior, and each of which has their own authority to transact both compliance and regulation, as well as strategic planning and research to inform better decisions in general. And of course, through our system of checks and balances, these agencies are accountable to the Congress, but they also rely on each other to inform a more comprehensive approach to good energy policy making. Now, that model is actually mirrored again at the state level in maybe a little bit different way depending on the state. And so now we'll talk a little bit about the individual barriers and activities that make up a good energy policy approach. The great thing is that even though the federal level is dealing with the national priorities, which are somewhat coherent, it's important that a state deal with the respective needs of its electorate and its region in terms of resources and objectives and approach to policy making. So what we have is a framework that's mirrored kind of at the state level with the legislative authority and the agencies. But then what matters to individual citizens obviously is very specific to the region. Another thing that's really interesting about the history of energy is how there have been these sort of 50 to 70 year cycles where major prime energy resources came into favor, were perfected, were made abundantly available at lower cost, and then were displaced by something new. So we see the history in the US was originally a biomass wood sort of resource that gave way to coal, which gave way to natural gas, which is giving way to nuclear, and now in the new generation, it's renewables. So obviously energy policy has had to adapt to that evolution and transition to bring newer, cleaner, more affordable and sustainable energy sources to market. Now, to mirror some of the multi-decade trends that we talked about, the transition of coal to gas to nuclear and renewables, with every one of these steps, there is a significant burden and responsibility on energy policymakers. The first piece is to make sure the oversight and compliance of delivering available sources at scale is done well. So that is environmental regulations, the regulation of the grid and the exchange of power and the metering and so forth, that these activities are overseen by aspects of the energy market, of the energy policy world. There's another really significant piece looking forward which relates to strategic planning. And so energy policymakers are looking for good data from a host of resources like academic research institutions, NGOs, private companies that are developing new innovations. And normally this cycle follows, again, a multi-year evolutional phase from preparation to creation to expansion and ultimately saturation. So if we think about it like solar is at a point where markets are expanding, right? The early investments occurred over the previous decade or two or even further back. And now those technologies are becoming much more affordable, much more deployable at scale. Whereas I'd say energy storage is still a little bit more in its infancy in the market preparation and market creation phase. It appears that batteries will be an important player in delivering good energy storage to the grid in the coming years. And there are other technologies that are even more preliminary, more rudimentary at the bench scale in laboratories. But the goal, of course, is to make sure that we can populate, the future horizon of resources so that we maintain this mix of diverse solutions that are affordable and sustainable. So with the preparation and creation of new technologies for the market, the government, whether that's federal, state, or local, might have to do something to ensure that good new ideas can be sustained. So in that sense, there are several mechanisms to support good new technologies and ideas. An example of that is on this slide where we see, subsidies can play an important role when the cost may be not quite affordable to prepare the market, and so the government subsidizes good ideas. Another one might be net metering, where, for example, you may want to add some solar, but you'd like to get the benefit of your generation back from the utility. So net metering allows you to do kind of an exchange of power that you consume from the grid and compare that and offset that against energy that you're providing back to the grid. Of course, these policies are not exclusive to electricity, but the electric sector is one very large piece over which we need good energy policy. But the other major piece is non-stationary energy or energy for transportation. In general, we know and have talked about in the prior videos about how the supply of electricity is relatively diverse. We have renewables, solar and wind, and geothermal and hydro. We have natural gas, coal, nuclear, and so forth. So that's excellent because we can make sure we're not overly reliant on one thing. In the case of transportation energy, it's mostly about oil and natural gas to convey people and goods around. So the energy policy needs for commodities like oil and gas are quite a bit different than they would be for electric power, but the policy framework, again, at various jurisdictions is kind of similar in its structure. Now let's expand a bit more on the policy priorities for transportation, which are super important. That's a third of our energy consumption in the US and most developed countries. A big one is fuel economy. You hear a lot about that. When you buy a new car, you'd like to know what that is. Actually, there's a federal roadmap that says what that corporate average fuel economy should be for years into the future. And obviously, we're trying to introduce, in a technology neutral way, more and more efficient vehicles. That includes hybrids and electric vehicles as well. So on the electric vehicle topic, we have a federal tax credit. And some of those are being fully depleted. So the question now for policymakers is, what should that level be to incentivize the use of this new technology, which has some environmental benefits. And then states can also activate subsidies for the EV promotion as well. Additional things we're doing are around biofuels, making sure that we have renewable fuels. In the case of some states, they've adopted low carbon fuel standards, which are also aiming to introduce energy supplies to the transportation sector that are more efficient. So in addition to good policies, you should check out our other videos that talk about how we use energy in the transportation sector and the innovations that are going into more effective transport overall. So then we could also think about the sub-state level for energy planning and decision making, which would involve a county jurisdiction or even a municipality or a city. And so they might be wondering, how should we do zoning? And an example of that is the model solar ordinance that we helped develop in partnership with a couple other universities in the state of Georgia. But giving kind of counties more information, more data, because often they have, limited expertise on their staff for some of these technical issues. And what we'd like to do is promote better awareness, and so they can make decisions for what are right for those communities. Okay, looking forward, we know that the priorities are going to include more efficiency, more clean energy, more affordability, more resilience. But often those challenges are complicated at the federal level. So states often have better flexibility to deal with them and execute good solutions. So the citizens have a really important voice with making good decisions around near-term and long-term energy planning and policy making. So one way that they do that is they gather and they talk about issues that are important to them. Another important way is for electing people that represent their views, maybe even writing letters, maybe being involved in organizations that can reflect a broad collective view of a certain interest. And so we encourage you to do more of that. We think that states are very capable of doing this well in the new generation, where energy is a very dynamic place, and renewables mean very different things in different states. And so be sure to tune into the next video where we'll dive down into sort of the nuts and bolts at the state level and how different electricity utilities are regulated and overseen.